The sun hit its peak at 4 in the afternoon. Most of us children were advised to play inside. It was unsafe to be out at that hour because of the risk of sunstroke, which we confirmed by touching our black hair with our hands after playing outside to feel the heat coming out of our heads. The summer after the end of second grade was one of the hottest summers we'd ever had in Monterrey. To stay cool inside our house, we laid on the floor tiles. Whenever my mother was home, she laid on them too, asleep with an opened book. My sisters had friends with houses they could visit at those hours. Sometimes their friends would come to our house too, and I would spend the day like a cat, roaming each room, looking out the windows, listening to other people's phone conversations through the cracks of the closet doors. My only friend was Melody. She was green and small, and she was a day older than me. I was quiet at home, not at all like my sisters, who were good at jokes and sometimes talked back to my parents. But somehow around Melody, I was different, as if Melody's hushed existence demanded a more wild one from me. Perhaps it saddened me that Melody had no sisters, so around her, I did as my sisters would. I remember one morning that summer when none of the mothers on our street worried. There was no school, there was no known danger. The older kids took care of the smaller kids. Most of the neighbors were friends with each other, especially the mothers who stayed home and did housework. After the fathers left to work, the mothers gathered on the sidewalk to talk. Some days they pulled tables together and played loteria. There was no real money involved in their gambling, just laughs and dry legumes for marking the called spaces. One of them, Rolanda, did have a taste for gambling, so she started her own loteria group, which eventually became a poker club. Rolanda had no husband. She had twin sons, Fer and David. They were known for shooting guns from the roof on holidays like Independence Day, Christmas, and New Year's Day. They had motorcycles, and both brothers knew how to drive cars, even though they were 12 years old. I did not know why Rolanda had no husband. I imagined it must have been something like divorce. I knew why the other neighbors with no husbands were alone from listening in on my mother's phone conversations. For example, I knew Laura, our next door neighbor, never had a husband because the father of her children already had another family. Javiera, our neighbor across the street, was married, but her husband had left him for his other family in Aguascalientes. My mother was born in the United States and went to work in an office, which made the neighbors think of her as eccentric. She was sometimes careless about pretending to follow the neighborhood's unspoken rules, like when she said, "More power to her," after Javiera became the second mother in our street to find an office job. On the morning when the mothers did not worry, the fathers, my mother, and Javiera were all gone for work. The neighborhood boys kicked the can around outside as if it was a real ball, while the sun was still climbing. My sisters and the other neighborhood girls sat on the sidewalk, comparing roller skates, sliding melted stickers on them. As I walked over to Melody's house, I realized that there was one dad who had not gone to work that day. Our old neighbor, Don Meme, had lost his job, and an unusual event was taking place. Don Meme sweeping the street for everyone to see he was doing just fine. His sons were all married off, and he lived in the biggest house on the street, with his wife, Doña Luz, and a dog whose name we did not know. We called the dog Perro Café, or brown dog, in the language my mother spoke at home. When we were together, Melody let me do most of the talking, but around other people, she was like one of the mothers. She could start a conversation with any neighbor or stranger. These conversations were perfect repetitions of her mother's mannerisms when talking to people, as if she could summon all the parts of herself that were inherited from her mother. It was a power of hers I secretly envied. Her ability to turn grown all of a sudden sometimes flashed in the middle of our play, without me noticing, but then it was there. As I unraveled a "wouldn't it be great if we had a pool that went from my backyard all the way to yours?" Melody observed the world that was real. She would say something about the moment, about Javiera, and how difficult it must be to be her. She suggested walking over to where Don Meme was chain smoking with Perro Café, taking a break from sweeping. She thought we should say hello. Don Meme asked us how we were doing and confirmed he had no job after we asked him if it was true. He then asked us if we had any work for him and his dog. I considered the question seriously, and after some thinking, I told him that perhaps he could rent Perro Café to people who needed to scare enemies, people who could not defend themselves, for example. I could tell that Don Meme was holding laughter in, but I used to think that was the way older people always addressed younger people. Most every time I spoke to an older person, they addressed me with held-in laughter. I imagined youth made older people happy. Don Meme asked me if I had any enemies. Had anyone been teasing me? Well, funny you ask, I said. I had been made fun of recently by a kid who lived a few houses down named Alfredo. He chased me and then pinched my face. He called me insults with words from his ranch. Don Meme laughed. Alfredo probably likes you. Don Meme offered Perro Café to scare Alfredo into not pinching me anymore. Melody and I thought this was a good idea. I don't have money, I told him. The first one is always free, he replied. Melody and I walked away with Perro Café on a leash. We walked the sidewalks of the 9 houses between Don Meme's and Alfredo's in the sun. Once there, we called his name, and when he looked out his window, I knew I had an upper hand. Alfredo was terrified of dogs. So I yelled, "If you ever pinch me again, I will have my dog bite your face." Perro Café was an old, useless dog, and Melody and I knew there was no way we could make him bite Alfredo. Still, we let him off his leash, and he lay for a nap in the shady spot outside Alfredo's house. I was a satisfied customer. "We should do something nice for Don Meme for lending us his dog for free," I said. It was just before noon. Melody and I decided to ask Javiera's son if we could pick up some of the walnuts from their yard to take to Don Meme, who has no job. He said it was fine, but he left us alone to go back outside to play a little longer before the sun peaked. Javiera's tree dropped lots of walnuts every year, but there were none on the ground. They were still green on the tree. So we climbed the tree and picked some. From the tree, we could see the backyards for Melody's house and mine too. We could ask our dads to make one big backyard with a pool, I said. After we gathered enough green walnuts, we put them in a plastic bag and walked over to Don Meme's house. We knocked on the door and Doña Luz answered crying. "Miguel is not home." "Is Miguel Don Meme?" I asked. Doña Luz cleaned her tears with a tissue that was falling apart into little pieces. One of them stuck to the side of her face, but Melody and I didn't say anything. Her voice was almost in 3rd grade, like ours, when she cried. She told us that some boys had shot Torombolo and that Miguel had taken him to get buried. All of Doña Luz's words were a strange soup in my mind, made with names I did not know. I was swirling in a surreal moment when Melody's face transformed, with red streaks, her eyes going in 2 different directions, her lips twisting with a string of saliva connecting the top to the bottom. Doña Luz pulled her into her apron, shaking off all traces of Melody's imaginary years of life. Torombolo. Why does Doña Luz call her husband Miguel? I felt my arm being pulled, and a voice asked me if I was okay in English. It was my mother. Still crying, the story came out of Doña Luz's mouth, like pebbles falling down a quarry. Melody and I scared Alfredo with Torombolo. Alfredo borrowed a gun from Rolanda's boys to shoot the dog. The little pieces of her tissue landed softly on the ground. My mother covered her mouth and then wrapped her arms around Doña Luz. I was told to go into the house and wait. Outside, as the fathers arrived for lunch, the neighbors began gathering by Don Meme's gate. Then they all went over to Rolanda's house to demand that she take the gun away from her kids. God forbid those kids shoot you babies, my mother said when she came back home, and she said it in English too.